what if the reason your prayers feel empty isn't because God is silent, but because you've been misunderstanding the entire purpose of prayer from the very beginning? And what if the moment you finally understood it, everything in your life, your peace, your direction, even your sense of purpose could begin to change faster than you ever thought possible? Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to admit, especially later in life when they finally try to pray for the first time. It feels awkward. It feels uncertain. You sit there, maybe close your eyes, maybe fold your hands, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice whispers, what am I even doing? Am I just talking to myself? And that question doesn't just pass by, it lingers, it grows. And before you know it, it starts to weaken your faith before it even has a chance to grow. But that doubt leads to an even deeper question, one that silently blocks countless people from ever truly connecting with God. If God already knows everything, every pain, every need, every injustice in the world, then why would he need to hear it from you? Why would you need to remind him that people are starving, suffering, or struggling? And if he is truly a loving father, why doesn't he just act? At first, that question sounds logical, almost impossible to argue against. But hidden inside it is a misunderstanding so subtle, yet so powerful, that it quietly keeps people distant from God for years. Because yes, God can do everything on his own. He doesn't need you. But that's exactly where the mystery begins. Because despite not needing you, he chooses to work with you. And that changes everything. Because God doesn't just act alone, he collaborates. He works with his angels, with his saints, and most surprisingly, with you. And if that sounds strange, it's because we've been conditioned to think of God as distant, detached, operating independently of human involvement. But when you actually look at Scripture, a completely different pattern emerges, one that most people overlook. There's always someone bringing something to God, always someone participating, always someone offering, even when what they have seems insignificant. And that's where things start to get interesting. Because there's a moment in the Gospels that reveals this pattern in a way that's almost easy to miss. A young boy steps forward with something so small it almost seems irrelevant. 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's it. No miracle yet. No spectacle. Just something ordinary. Something insufficient. And yet, that small offering becomes the starting point of feeding thousands. Now think about that for a second. Could Jesus have fed those people without the boy? Of course. Instantly, effortlessly. But he didn't. And that's the detail most people skip over. Because it reveals something deeper about how God chooses to work. He waits. He invites. He allows you to bring what you have, even if it feels like nothing. And then he multiplies it. But here's where many people get stuck. Because even when they try to pray, even when they try to offer something, they get distracted by a different kind of voice. A quieter one, more persistent. It doesn't ask questions, it makes statements. He's not listening. He doesn't care. You've prayed before and nothing happened. And over time, those thoughts don't just visit, they settle in. They become beliefs. But what if those thoughts are completely wrong? Because here's the reality most people aren't prepared to hear. God hears every single prayer. Not some, not the important ones, not just the perfectly worded ones, every single one. But, and this is where it gets difficult, he doesn't always answer the way you expect. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no, and sometimes it's something better that you couldn't see yet. And that delay, that silence, that unexpected answer is exactly where most people lose patience. But what if that moment is actually where your transformation begins? Because prayer isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about learning how to align yourself with something greater. And that's exactly what Jesus was trying to teach, but not in the way most people assume. Because when he spoke about prayer, he didn't tell people to use more words. he actually warned against it. He said not to babble endlessly, not to think that repeating words would somehow make you more heard. And that sounds almost contradictory at first. Because if God already knows what you need before you ask, then why ask at all? And that question brings us right to the edge of something deeper, something most people never fully explore. Because the purpose of prayer isn't information, it's relationship. And relationships don't grow through performance, they grow through honesty. Which means prayer isn't about sounding impressive, it's about being real. It's about speaking to God the same way you would speak to someone who truly knows you, someone who sees past your words and straight into your heart. And that idea sounds simple, but living it is something entirely different. Because the moment you actually try to sit in silence, everything changes. The noise doesn't disappear, it gets louder. Your thoughts start racing, your body feels restless, every distraction suddenly feels urgent, and that's the moment most people give up because it feels like failure. But what if that moment is actually the beginning of something working? Because there was a man who struggled with this exact thing. Someone who came from one of the loudest, most chaotic environments imaginable, Wall Street in New York City. Constant movement, constant noise, constant pressure. And then suddenly, he was placed in complete silence. No distractions, no stimulation, just stillness. And at first, it felt impossible. Because how do you go from constant noise to hearing nothing? How do you sit still when your mind has been trained to never stop moving? He didn't think it would work. In fact, he was convinced it wouldn't. But he followed the process anyway, not because he believed in it, but out of obedience. And for a while, nothing happened. No voice, no clarity, no breakthrough, just silence. But then something unexpected happened. Not to him, but to someone else. Another brother in his community stood up one night and shared something, a poem. And it wasn't just any poem. It was powerful, deep, unexpected. The kind of thing that didn't make sense coming from someone who wasn't known for eloquence or creativity. And that moment created something dangerous, comparison. Because suddenly a thought formed, quiet but sharp. Why not me? And without even realizing it, he turned that thought into a question directed at God. You've never given me something like that. And what happened next changed everything. Because in that exact moment, he heard a response. Clear, direct, unmistakable. You've never asked. And just like that, everything shifted. Because it revealed something most people overlook, not because it's hidden, but because it's uncomfortable. Sometimes the reason we don't receive is because we never actually ask. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because asking once didn't immediately change anything. He went back the next day and asked again. Nothing. The next day, nothing. 10 days, still nothing. And this is the part where most people would stop because it feels pointless, repetitive, even discouraging. But he didn't stop. And then one day, without warning, it happened. Not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly. Words began to flow. A poem poured out onto the page effortlessly. Not forced, not constructed, but given. And it wasn't just words. It carried meaning, depth, symbolism, something far beyond what he believed he was capable of creating. And that moment raises a question you can't ignore. What changed? Was it the asking? Was it the waiting? Or was it something deeper? Something that only happens when persistence meets surrender. Because what happened next makes the story even more unbelievable. That one moment didn't stay a moment. It became a pattern. Poems started coming again and again, sometimes even in the middle of the night, waking him up, interrupting his sleep, demanding to be written down. And within a year, there were so many that they became a book. Now pause for a second, Because this isn't just a story about creativity. It's a story about what happens when someone learns how to listen. Because the question isn't whether God speaks. The real question is, have you learned how to hear? And that's where things get even more interesting, because hearing God isn't about volume, it's about tuning. Just like a radio, the signal is already there. But if you're not on the right frequency, you won't hear anything but static. And that's exactly where most people struggle. Not because God is silent, but because they've never been taught how to tune in. And the way you do that is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable because it requires something most people avoid: silence, stillness, and time. Just 10 or 15 minutes a day with no distractions, no phone, no noise, just you and the willingness to listen. But here's the part that makes people hesitate. What if nothing happens? What if you sit there and hear nothing? What if you try and it feels like you're wasting your time? That fear is exactly what stops people from ever discovering what comes next. Because what comes next doesn't always feel dramatic. It doesn't always sound like a voice. Sometimes it's a thought, an image, a memory, a feeling you didn't expect. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. But if you stay consistent, something begins to change. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeably. But then it becomes familiar, recognizable, and eventually normal. And that's when everything starts to shift. Because prayer stops being something you do and becomes someone you are. But just as you begin to understand this, another layer reveals itself. One that completely reframes what prayer is actually doing to you and why its power goes far beyond anything you've experienced so far. And it starts with a simple idea, one that sounds almost too easy to matter. Just sitting there, doing nothing, could actually be changing you in ways you can't yet see. But how? And why would something so simple be so powerful? That's exactly where the story takes a turn you don't expect. And it leads to a truth that has transformed lives, even in the most impossible situations. But to understand that, you have to see what happens when prayer doesn't just feel quiet, but becomes the force that pulls someone back from the edge of complete darkness. Because it's one thing to talk about prayer in quiet rooms, in peaceful moments, in controlled environments where everything feels calm, but it's something entirely different to see what prayer can do when a life is completely falling apart. And that's where this story stops being theoretical and becomes undeniable. Because there was a man not just struggling, not just confused, but completely lost. His name was Bartolo Longo, and if you only heard the ending of his story, you'd think it was inspiring, maybe even predictable. But the truth is, his beginning was so dark, so far removed from anything holy that most people would have written him off completely. He was born into a devout Catholic family, surrounded by faith, structure, and belief. But life doesn't always move in straight lines. And when he went off to college, everything started to change. Because instead of being formed by truth, he was surrounded by voices that slowly began to distort it. And here's where things take a dangerous turn. Because it wasn't just doubt that entered his life, it was influence. Priests who had abandoned their vocation, teachers who no longer believed what they once preached, people who didn't just walk away from faith, but actively worked against it. And when you're young, searching, and trying to make sense of the world, those voices don't just pass by, they shape you. So little by little, Bartolo didn't just drift from his faith, he rejected it. But rejection wasn't enough. Because when someone walks away from light, they don't stay neutral for long. They go somewhere. And Bartolo went deeper than most people ever imagine. He began exploring the occult, not out of curiosity alone, but out of hunger, a desire for power, for knowledge, for something that felt real, something that felt immediate. And the deeper he went, the darker it became, until eventually he crossed a line that very few ever come back from. He was ordained not as a priest of God, but as a priest of Satan. Now stop for a second, because this isn't symbolic. This isn't metaphorical. This is real. Rituals, blasphemies, black masses, a complete inversion of everything he was raised to believe. And for a time, it probably felt powerful, because that's how deception works. It promises control. It promises freedom. It promises answers, but it never tells you the cost. And eventually, the cost comes due, because the same darkness that once felt empowering begins to turn on you. What once gave you a sense of control begins to consume you. And that's exactly what happened. Bartolo didn't just feel lost anymore. He became tormented, not just emotionally, but mentally and physically. His thoughts became chaotic. His body weakened. And the very forces he once aligned himself with began to destroy him from the inside out. And this is where the story reaches a point most people don't survive. Because when everything collapses, when your mind is unstable, your body is failing, and your soul feels beyond saving, there's a moment where one thought starts to creep in. There's no way back. And for Bartolo, that thought became so overwhelming that he began to consider ending his life. But right at that edge, something unexpected happened. Not a miracle, not a vision, a conversation, because he reached out not to God, but to a professor. And that decision, small, almost insignificant, became the turning point. Because that professor didn't have all the answers, but he pointed Bartolo to someone who might. A Dominican priest, an exorcist. Now think about the irony. The man who once led others into darkness now needed someone to pull him out of it. And for 3 weeks, that's exactly what happened. Not instantly, not easily, but slowly, intentionally, through guidance, confession, and something Bartolo hadn't experienced in a long time, mercy. And eventually, after everything he had done, after everything he had become, he was forgiven, set free, delivered. And you would think that's where the story ends. But it doesn't, because being freed from darkness doesn't always mean you feel worthy of light. And that's the part no one talks about. Because even after his sins were forgiven, Bartolo couldn't accept it. The weight of his past didn't disappear, it stayed, whispering, accusing, reminding him of everything he had done. And no matter what he was told, one thought kept repeating itself. God could never forgive someone like me. And that thought is more dangerous than any external force, because it doesn't attack your body, it attacks your hope. And without hope, even freedom feels empty. So once again, he found himself at the edge. But this time, something different happened. Because instead of darkness pulling him deeper, he heard something that would change everything. A homily, simple, direct, almost easy to ignore. But inside it was a message about something most people underestimate: the rosary. Now, at first, that might not sound powerful. It might even sound repetitive, ordinary, something people do without thinking. But in that moment, it became something else entirely. Because Bartolo didn't just hear it, he believed it. And in a moment of desperation, clarity, and maybe even surrender, he dropped to his knees and made a decision that would redefine his entire life. He said, "If it is true that those who spread the rosary will be saved, then I will not leave this earth without spreading it." And that wasn't just a prayer. It was a commitment. Because from that moment on, everything changed. Not instantly, not dramatically, but directionally, because every single day he prayed. Every single day he shared. Every single day he stayed consistent. And slowly, something began to happen. The same man who once led people into darkness was now leading them toward light. The same voice that once spoke against truth was now spreading it. The same life that seemed completely destroyed was being rebuilt, piece by piece, prayer by prayer, day by day. And this is where the story takes a turn that almost feels impossible. Because Bartolo didn't just change his life, he transformed the lives of thousands. He built churches, he wrote books, he brought people back to faith. He became a force of good so powerful that it reached far beyond anything he could have imagined in his darkest moments. And then something happened that no one could have predicted at the beginning of his story. He became a saint. Let that sink in. A man who once served darkness became a symbol of holiness. A man who once felt unforgivable was lifted up as an example for the entire world. And it all began not with perfection, but with prayer. Now here's the question you can't ignore. If someone that far gone, that broken, that lost could be completely transformed, what does that mean for you? Because maybe your life isn't that extreme. Maybe you haven't gone that far. But maybe, just maybe, you've believed a similar lie, that you're too far behind, that you've made too many mistakes. That change is possible, but not for you. And if that thought has ever crossed your mind, then this story isn't just inspiring, it's personal, because it reveals something most people don't realize. Prayer doesn't just comfort you, it rebuilds you. It redirects you. It restores what you thought was permanently broken. But only if you stay, only if you continue, only if you refuse to give up, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Because what's happening beneath the surface is often far more powerful than what you can see. And just when you begin to understand that, another question rises. If prayer is this powerful, if it can transform lives, redirect destinies, and even bring someone back from the edge, then why don't we do it more often? Why do we hesitate? Why do we delay? Because the answer to that question reveals something even deeper about human nature, something that quietly blocks us, even when we know the truth. And it has nothing to do with time, nothing to do with knowledge, and everything to do with something far more dangerous, something that can exist even in the most religious people, something that looks right on the outside, but is completely wrong on the inside. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it's the very thing that Jesus himself warned about, and it's hiding in a place you wouldn't expect. That hidden danger isn't always external. It isn't always a rival, a temptation, or an obvious attack. Most often, it lives quietly inside us. It's doubt disguised as reason, fear disguised as practicality, complacency disguised as comfort, and it's subtle, almost invisible, but powerful enough to stop prayer from working in your life. Because here's the truth that Father Dan Reehil emphasizes. Prayer doesn't just fail because God isn't listening. It fails when we stop truly believing, when we let skepticism, impatience, or distraction take the driver's seat. Think about Bartolo for a moment. His salvation didn't happen because he was perfect. It didn't happen because he had never sinned or made mistakes. It happened because in the darkest point of his life, he surrendered fully. He took the step to believe that something bigger than himself could intervene. And that's the part most people overlook. Prayer is not a checklist. It's not about saying the right words, performing the right rituals, or showing off your devotion. It's about total surrender. It's about believing, truly believing that transformation is possible even when everything in your life screams the opposite. That's why Father Dan warns that the devil's most dangerous trick is not in grand temptations, but in quiet discouragement. In the tiny voice that whispers, it's too late, or you're not enough, or God could never forgive you. That voice is relentless. It is patient, and it will try to convince you to abandon prayer before you even start. But the story of Bartolo proves something radical. No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how impossible it seems, prayer has the power to reach you. It can heal what seems unhealable. It can restore what seems lost forever. And it can redirect your life toward a destiny you never imagined. Father Dan says, this is not just spiritual theory. This is reality. He has seen people transformed, families restored, and lives rebuilt simply because someone chose to pray consistently and faithfully. And here's the kicker. You don't need grand gestures. You don't need wealth, knowledge, or recognition. You just need one thing, the courage to start. One prayer, one moment of surrender, one decision to believe that what feels impossible is actually possible with God. So the real question becomes, are you willing to take that step to push past doubt, past fear, past the excuses that have held you back? Because the moment you do, everything can change. Not tomorrow, not next week, but starting right now. And if you think about it, isn't that the kind of power most of us are searching for? The power to transform our lives, to find hope where there is despair, to rise from failure into purpose, to see light where there is darkness. That is the secret of prayer. Not just words, not just devotion, but consistent, humble surrender. The kind that can move mountains, restore souls, and rewrite destinies. And here's the reality Father Dan Reehil leaves us with. Prayer is not a casual habit, it's a lifeline. It's not just a moment of words whispered in a chapel or in your bedroom. It is the way we connect with the source of everything, the one who can transform impossibilities into realities. Look back at Bartolo Longo. He went from the depths of despair, consumed by darkness, to sainthood, a life utterly changed. And it all began with prayer. Not grand public displays, but quiet, humble, consistent prayer. One act of surrender that grew into a lifetime of miracles. That's what God wants from us. Not perfection, not brilliance, not accolades. Just willingness, just trust, just the courage to say, Lord, I'm here. I need you. Prayer is a dialogue. It's a relationship. It's not about impressing God with words or deeds. It's about opening your heart completely and letting him speak, guide, and transform. And the moment we do that, life begins to change. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then you notice it everywhere. The peace where there was anxiety, the clarity where there was confusion, the hope where there was despair. Father Dan reminds us that this isn't theoretical, this is active. You don't have to wait for the perfect moment. You don't have to have the perfect prayer or the perfect life or the perfect heart. Start where you are. Even 5 minutes a day in silence, in humility, asking God to speak can spark a chain reaction that transforms everything. And the most powerful part, God doesn't just hear your prayers, he responds. Maybe not in the timing or the way you expect, but always in the way that leads to your ultimate good. He partners with us. He invites us to participate in miracles. He takes the little we bring, our doubts, our fears, our small offerings, and multiplies them into grace beyond imagination. So today, remember this. Your prayer matters. Your voice matters. Your faith matters. The world may seem dark, confusing, and overwhelming, but prayer is your weapon, your lifeline, your pathway to transformation. And if God could save Bartolo Longo, the man once bound to darkness itself, imagine what he can do with you. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Begin. Speak. Listen. Surrender. And watch as the impossible becomes possible, one prayer at a time. Because with God, everything truly is possible. And that is the secret power of prayer.